Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be updating my guide on Raigon, the Exiled Prince, and so please sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Raigon is a strong melee DPS champion who excels in dealing good sustained damage while sustaining himself with some heals. He's quite a straightforward and easy champion to learn and play decently well, so he's perfect for beginners who enjoy playing melee champions as opposed to ranged champions. The reason for this is that he has access to some very direct abilities that does what they need to do. Some of his abilities heal himself for a little bit, some protect him and lets him move around the battlefield smoothly, some allow him to control enemies decently well, and most importantly they all deal pretty decent damage. These abilities make him good at engaging and sticking to enemies to deal sustained damage, and depending on what Battlerites he chooses, he can deal some decent burst damage as well. However, his weakness is that he doesn't have a lot of ranged poke and he can't really do much at a distance, and so he will have to go up close to do meaningful damage, and this might put him at a risk of dying quite easily, especially if he messes up. In short, I think Raigon is a fairly well-rounded and beginner-friendly champion. He has good sustain, escape and control options, and pretty good damage in melee, but his damage is lacking a bit at range, which means Raigon is quite susceptible to being bursted down if played incorrectly. So yeah, that was just a brief summary of Raigon as a champion. Now I'll just quickly give a rundown on how this video is structured before I get into the meat of the guide. As with my older champion guides, I have split this guide up into 5 sections, and that's abilities, playstyle, Battlerites, Loadouts, and team comps. I have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below, so feel free to jump directly to a certain section that you need if you wish. I'd like to point out that I do not have a gameplay tip section in my champion guides anymore, since I feel like some of the tips are quite repetitive from champion to champion, and so these little gameplay tips will instead pop up in the video when they are relevant, I suppose. And so yeah, with all that being said, let's begin. First off, abilities. Raigon's left click or mouse 1 ability is Sword Slash, and this is his basic melee attack. What it does is Raigon will do a strike with his sword in front of him, and this attack deals 10 damage to the target that it hits. Each successful attack on an enemy or the central orb charges up his weapon by 1 charge, up to a maximum of 3 charges, and these charges basically improve the power of his mouse 2 ability, Retribution. Not only that, each successful mouse 1 attack also reduces the cooldown of his mouse 2 ability by 1 second, and so you can typically use your mouse 2, follow it up with 3 successful hits with the mouse 1, and you'll have his mouse 2 ready again. So yeah, pretty straightforward so far. On to Raigon's mouse 2 ability. His mouse 2 ability is Retribution, and what it does is Raigon will do a little short range dash forward, and upon hitting an enemy, the attack will deal 11 damage to the main target and a lesser amount to targets who happen to be caught in the area of effect. Raigon will also heal himself for 7 health if he hits an opponent, so this is one of his main abilities that give him some good health sustain. With each weapon charge that you generate with your mouse 1 ability, the next Retribution or mouse 2 cast can be improved in terms of its damage and healing done. Each weapon charge gives 3 extra damage and 2 extra healing, and so essentially when you have a maximum of 3 charges, you'll be dealing 20 damage to the main target and you'll heal yourself for 13 health. Pretty decent, I would say. You definitely want to try to hit your target with it if you have 3 charges, since the improvement in damage and healing is quite significant. Do try to remember that you can do 20 damage with this ability if you have 3 charge as well, since this is very useful information, especially when you're trying to fight for that last hit on the center orb. Because this mouse 2 ability has a little dash to it, this is actually one of Raigon's main way of sticking to enemies once he has successfully gotten close to them. So your typical combo when chasing down an enemy would be to mouse 1 them until you have 3 charges, mouse 2 them to make sure you stick to them, and continue repeating this process. Of course, you have to watch out for enemies using counters or retaliating against you in some way, but if they're just trying to run and not fight back in some way, this is your most efficient way of doing good sustained damage, since you're not committing any major cooldowns by doing this. While it's best to use this ability for its damage and healing, sometimes this ability can be used to just avoid your enemy's attacks as well if you're desperate, so that's something to keep in mind. After all, the cooldown on the attack is just 5 seconds, and it is reducible by your mouse 1 attack, so you'll have it back up and ready in no time anyways. Moving on, Raigon's spacebar ability is Heavenly Strike, and this is his main movement or escape ability. What it does is Raigon will leap into the air, becoming invulnerable while jumping, and strike down at the targeted location a distance away, dealing 20 damage to all enemies within the small area in front of him. The ability overall is very good, but its only downside is that the jump distance is very limited, and by that I mean you cannot adjust it very much, so you will always have to jump a certain distance in the targeted direction. This makes it quite inconsistent for damage if you're not familiar with its range yet, and so I usually recommend saving it for escaping most of the time. Having said that though, using it for damage is not the worst idea ever, but you need to have a plan if you want to do something like that. We'll get more into this ability later in the playstyle section. Next up, Raigon's Q ability is Parry, and this is his main defensive ability. It works kind of like a counter, but it's not really a counter. What it does is that Raigon will put up a deflection barrier thing for 1.5 seconds, and during this time the barrier can deflect the next 5 melee and projectile attacks that are directed at him. Ranged projectiles that hit the barrier will be redirected toward the current position of your mouse, and melee attacks on the barrier are countered, making the attacker stunned for 0.5 seconds and suffer 12 damage instead in return. Pretty cool little ability. Just like most other defensive abilities, area of effect attacks still affect Raigon while he's parrying, and so you're not completely invulnerable to damage in this state. But having said that, because you can still move while parrying, you can typically move out of the area of effects if they are not too large, but bigger ones might still get you since you will be moving at a slightly reduced movement speed. Moving on, Raigon's E ability is Seismic Shock, and this is only ranged ability. This ranged ability of Raigon's happens to be his best initiating ability as well, because what it does is Raigon will charge up his attack, and after that brief charge up period, he will fire a projectile which deals 10 damage to the target it hits while launching them up into the air. While the enemy is in the air, they are immune to damage, but this air time gives Raigon some time to close the gap and potentially get close enough to start attacking them. Typically, you should get close enough where you can use a mouse tool to get within melee range of the target. If you are very used to the airtime of this ability, you can time your other abilities so that they hit right when the enemy lands, and you can deal some massive burst damage this way. We'll get into some of the combos you can set up with your E ability later. So yeah, that's about it on Raigon's abilities which doesn't require energy. Now let us move on to those which do. Starting with Raigon's R ability, Dragon Palm. What Dragon Palm does for 25 energy is Raigon will do a little dash forward, strike an enemy with his palm, knock them back a medium distance, and inflict a 1 second fading snare. This initial strike deals 8 damage, and it typically interrupts casting of most abilities as an added hidden effect as well. If an enemy is knocked back into a wall, they will be dealt an additional 10 damage, and so this means that whenever your R ability is ready to be used, you will want to try to put the target in between yourself and the wall to try to make use of this burst damage from your R ability. The nice thing about abilities which can displace enemies is that you can potentially be quite creative or sneaky with them. For example, you can use your R ability to knock enemies back into the death vortex so that they continue to take that 15 damage periodically, or perhaps another use for your R ability could be to knock the orb back towards your team, and then it can be secured more easily. So yeah, quite a versatile ability I would say. On to Raigon's EX abilities. His first EX ability is his shift left click ability, Slicing Winds. What this ability does for 25 energy is Raigon simply infuses his blade, making him gain 2 charges of Slicing Winds. These Slicing Wind charges allows Raigon's next Mouse 1 attacks to turn into these ranged projectile attacks which deals 10 damage and heals Raigon for 12. These projectiles are rather slow and short ranged, but they're very good since they both heal you and do damage in an area in front of Raigon, which can sometimes be very handy, but do keep in mind the reduced damage it does when it hits more than one enemy. So yeah, when you're in need of health, don't hesitate to use this ability to charge up some Slicing Wind charges. Just bear in mind that you can only have up to 3 charges, so make sure you use one Mouse 1 attack first before charging up a second time, otherwise one charge will be wasted. Next up, Raigon's second EX ability is his Shift E ability, Tectonic Shock. This ability is Raigon's hard CC ability, and what it does is pretty much the same as his base E ability, but the difference is that with this ability, the enemy is incapacitated upon landing, and this will allow Raigon and his teammates to set up highly damaging combos. If you're still unfamiliar with the CC effects in this game, incapacitate just means that the enemy will be unable to do anything, but any damage will break that incapacitate effect and let them move again. So yeah, having a hard CC that can be used from a distance is really handy, so I definitely recommend using this ability if you have some spare energy, since it really helps with setting up your spacebar and R abilities, or your teammates' hard hitting abilities as well. Just make sure you get used to hitting this ability though, since you don't get your energy refunded if you miss with this ability. Finally, Raigon's ultimate ability on the F key is Wrath of the Tiger, and what this ability does is Raigon will do a long dash, and hitting an enemy or target with this dash will immediately do 20 damage to the target. Upon hitting a target, a large circle will appear around the target, and all enemies, including the central orb within this circle, will start to take up to 84 damage over 3 seconds. This damage is split among all targets within the area, and so if there are more than one target in the area, the potential for dealing true damage isn't as high, but the ultimate ability is still a pretty good zoning tool since enemies are encouraged to immediately leave the area if possible. So yeah, pretty decent ultimate ability I would say. It's not really as strong as something like Ashkar's ultimate ability, but it still has its uses and it can do some nice damage too if you make sure that the enemy has already used their cooldowns before you use it on them, especially if you're going for maximum damage. If enemies successfully get out of the area and your ultimate ability still has some remaining duration, you can actually press F to jump out of the ultimate earlier so as to continue attacking your enemies who have run out of the area or rejoin your allies sooner. Somehow, not many people know about this little functionality with the ultimate ability. And so yeah, that's about it for Raigon's abilities. Now let us move on and talk a little bit about his playstyle. Raigon's playstyle is pretty straightforward in a sense that most of his abilities have a pretty defined function. This fact makes him rather easy to pick up at the beginning, but this will also mean that you will need to rely more on unpredictability at higher levels to make sure that enemies cannot read what you might do next as easily. So yeah, if you find that you were doing well with Raigon up to a certain point and suddenly realize that you're not doing as well anymore, it's probably because you're being quite predictable in the way you play and better enemies can adapt to it very quickly. So back on topic, the general playstyle when playing with Raigon would be to try to initiate with your E ability or perhaps your EXE ability if you have the energy for it, and then close the gap and try to deal as much damage with your mouse 1s and mouse 2s. Typically, the fastest way to close the gap onto the enemy after initiating with your E ability is to jump in to do damage on the enemy with your spacebar, since this gives you a good damage lead and you're also already right next to the enemy and you can immediately start attacking them with your mouse 1s and mouse 2s. But if you recall in the earlier section, I mentioned about saving your spacebar for escaping, especially if you're not familiar with using it yet. The reason for this is because enemies will generally be ready to punish you for wasting an escape cooldown to jump in unnecessarily. While it feels good and awesome if you can strike an enemy with a jump and continue to pummel them with your other abilities, more often than not, your enemies will have some answers to you jumping in and you might get punished for it. Unless you're very certain that your target is mostly isolated with most of their cooldowns expended or that they are almost dead, then maybe it might be worth it to take the risk and jump in attempts to secure some good damage or a potential kill. There might be cases where you could use your spacebar to jump in aggressively and try to make a play happen, but just make sure that you have a solid escape plan that you'll be ready to execute should your original plan not go out too well. If you jumped in with your spacebar ability, then your Q ability would typically be your escape plan. Enemies will typically stop attacking you when you're using your Q ability, and so using it and then backing off is a good way to disengage and wait for your cooldowns to replenish so that you can jump in again once your abilities are ready. Just be careful that you move a little bit slower with your Q up, and so you are still vulnerable to area of effect abilities while parrying. If you like to play more conservatively, then saving your spacebar and using your Q to engage might be okay too. You can use your E to hit someone up, use your Q as you're walking in toward the enemy so that you don't get too much unnecessary fire, and close the remaining gap with your mouse 2 to engage on the enemy. This leaves your spacebar ready for further chasing should your enemy use their escape to jump away, or you can use it to disengage as well if you find that you overextended and you're being targeted by more than one enemy. So yeah, you can switch things up a bit here and there once in a while to make sure you stay unpredictable to your enemies. Moving on, using your R ability is quite straightforward since you'll mostly be trying to use it for damage if you find your enemy stuck between you and a wall, but as I mentioned earlier, you can use it on the op to reposition it if you want to, or use it as a means of interrupting your enemy's moves as well, so there are ways of being creative with it. But if you're unsure, since it does require committing some energy, then it's still mostly okay to just keep it for the damage or knocking enemies into the death vortex. During downtimes where you're waiting for your abilities to recharge and you realize that you have some damage to heal, then using your shift left click to prepare for your future engagement is a good idea as well. This allows you to last longer in the next engagement, and it makes it less stressful for your healer as well, since your health wouldn't drop as fast as it would without your slicing wind charges. About Raigon's ultimate ability, because you'll typically be using a lot of your energy on incapping people with your shift E and bursting people down with your R ability, it can sometimes be quite hard to find the energy to use the ultimate ability, but if you do manage to find the energy for it, using your ultimate ability on enemies who have used up their cooldowns can be extremely damaging to them, so definitely try to do that if you can. Just a little bit more on Raigon's mouse 2 ability. While it's good to generate some weapon charges before using your mouse 2 ability since it gives you more damage and healing, it can sometimes be helpful to use it just for catching up to the enemy, even if you have less than 3 charges, because that is you catching up to your enemy, and you can always generate more weapon charges and use your mouse 2 to better effect later on. You don't have to be too afraid to use your mouse 2 just for general repositioning and all that, as I mentioned earlier in the ability section. So yeah, that's mostly it on Raigon's playstyle. Now let us move on to Raigon's Battlerites options and loadouts. Because there are so many Battlerites currently and it will take me a long while to go through and describe all of them one by one, I'll just display them here, and if you wish, you can go ahead and pause the video to slowly read through them before continuing with the video. And so pause now to read through the first half. And now again for the second half. Okay, now that you've read all of them, let's continue. First off, I think that Raigon has two Battlerites that are often too good to pass up, and these are Aerial Strike and Headlong Rush. Headlong Rush isn't as mandatory as Aerial Strike, especially when you're up against melee enemies, but the increased dash range that you get with your Mouse 2 ability really helps you with closing the gap between you and your ranged target, and it just makes you output damage more consistently overall. Using your mouse 2 to reposition while having this Headlong Rush Battlerite is also more effective, since you can quite easily dash out of enemy area of effect abilities before they hit you. On to Aerial Strike, I think that this Battlerite is one of the most useful Battlerites for Raigon because it pretty much solves your main weakness as Raigon, and that is closing the gap efficiently. Hitting your E or Shift E ability while having the Aerial Strike Battlerite makes it so that you can now jump directly to the target shortly after the impact, and so this allows you to engage onto the enemy without committing any other cooldowns that may be important for dealing damage or escaping. Not to mention that you also get a bit of extra damage, a brief iframe that can sometimes be useful for avoiding some damage, and you also put an enemy out of the fight for a little longer than normal as well. Overall, a must-have Battlerite, even when you're up against all melee enemies where you don't have to rely on your E ability to gap close as much. So yeah, those two Battlerites are in my opinion very useful for Raigon regardless of matchups, so you wouldn't really go wrong for picking them up in your build. Now we'll look at the other Battlerites, which are a bit more situational. If you're looking for more burst damage output as Raigon, Royal Descent and Dragon Mastery are some really good Battlerites for helping you output more damage. Royal Descent boosts your spacebar damage by 30% and it gives you a nice 1.2 seconds fading snare, so these bonuses will allow you to easily catch up to enemies and deal more damage with your other attacks. The value of picking this Battlerite just goes higher and higher the better you get at hitting your spacebars consistently, so it's a pretty good Battlerite I would say. If you manage to knock an enemy into a wall with your first Dragon Palm, having the Dragon Mastery Battlerite would mean that you can easily knock them back into the wall one more time for even more burst damage. For this reason, this Dragon Mastery Battlerite is the Battlerite for crazy amounts of potential burst damage. As long as you do not miss or trigger an enemy's counter with this initial Dragon Palm cast, then the second R ability cast could even be used to knock enemies further into the Death Vortex, or maybe it could be used to knock the central orb more towards your team. Or if you feel like things are going to turn out badly for you if you overcommit, it can even be used as a mini escape since it does let Raigon dash a little bit. So yeah, quite a neat little Battlerite and definitely very strong when used correctly. If you're looking for more survivability with Raigon, then taking Duelist, Invigorate or Overflowing Power in that order can potentially help with that. Duelist is in my opinion the best survival Battlerite for Raigon, since if you can time your parry nicely, you heal for quite a bit from those deflected attacks, and you also gain that Slicing Wind charge to heal yourself for another 12 more when you hit an enemy with it. Invigorate can help quite a bit with your survival as well, since it does give guaranteed healing to you and your allies, and you can move at 100% movement speed. The 100% movement speed means that you can get out of area of effect abilities faster, reposition faster, and all of these just means that you'll be more safe and you lose less health overall. Overflowing Power used to give you a Slicing Wind charge whenever you use your spacebar, but since the recent change to its functionalities, it is a little less consistent with its healing now. You now need to hit at least one enemy with it to gain a Slicing Wind charge, and so its power in terms of keeping you alive has gone down quite a bit. I generally recommend taking Duelist and Invigorate first before even considering Overflowing Power, since hitting enemies with your spacebar itself is quite inconsistent already. If you're looking for more control, perhaps like when you need to peel for teammates and play a more defensive role because of the team compositions, then Binding Light, Hawk Dive and Riposte are some good options. Binding Light makes it much harder for enemies to chase after you or your allies, or outrun you for that matter, so it can be a pretty good pickup if you need to peel for your teammates, or you feel you might have trouble keeping up with some of the enemy team's faster champions. The 50% weaken effect that you can apply when you take the Hawk Dive Battlerite can be a pretty good pickup when you know that you'll be jumping onto enemy melees who like to chase after your teammates. This weaken debuff will drastically reduce their damage output, and so your teammate will have a much easier time surviving those incoming attacks. Even if you're not trying to help a teammate, getting this debuff onto enemies that you're targeting would mean that they would definitely lose the trade against you should they retaliate, and so it can be good in those scenarios as well. When you're up against enemies that have no counter abilities, taking Riposte can be a very solid option since the mini stuns that you get at the end of your parry ability is super disruptive and it can lock enemies in position long enough for you and your teammates to follow up with even more damaging abilities. Riposte was changed to trigger counters nowadays, and that's why you typically don't want to pick it against enemies that have counters. But having said that, if you are willing to micromanage your parries manually and make sure to cancel them in time if you know that the enemy has yet to use their counter abilities, then I guess it can still be a decent pick sometimes. I'm just not sure if the reward is worth the effort at that point, that's all. A couple of Battlerites which are actually pretty decent but doesn't fit a certain niche because they are Battlerites that change out your playstyle quite a bit would be Acrobatics and Soaring Speed. Acrobatics makes your spacebar ability a lot more consistent, especially if you're planning on using it offensively most of the time, since you will be hitting most of your spacebars with their flexible range. I'd say that you should pair it up with a second spacebar Battlite to make use of the increased hit rate with your spacebar ability, so that's an interesting build to consider if you're into jumping onto enemies to attack them. If you're not a fan of Aerial Strike for some reason, then Soaring Speed could be an alternative for closing the gap, since the Fading Haze is quite good in helping you chase enemies or just reposition in general. I personally seldom use Soaring Speed since Aerial Strike is all I need, but the movement speed from Soaring Strike seems like it could be quite fun and it gives you a bit of versatility as well. The remaining Battlerites that I haven't mentioned, that is Perilous Height, Agility, and the Tiger and the Dragon, aren't really that great in my opinion, and so I generally don't pick them at all. Perilous Height gives some nice damage, but the area of effect component is quite inconsistent to me, and so taking Aerial Strike is still better in general since it already puts you in range to attack your enemies, and I much prefer this playstyle. The movement speed from Agility is quite a nice bonus to have when chasing enemies, but I don't think it's really necessary because the other Battlerites just offer much more, while Agility only gives a measly 10% movement speed. The Tiger and the Dragon is a Battlite that improves your ultimate, and that itself is already a good enough reason not to pick it, since you will hardly use your ultimate ability. The bonus effect is also rather lackluster, and it doesn't give a good enough reason to pick it, unlike something like Rokan's ultimate Battlite, so I generally wouldn't pick this Battlite for Raigon. So yeah, those were my thoughts on most of the Battlerites for Raigon, but like I mentioned in my beginner tips video, I think you want to at least give a bit of thought about what Battlerites you're using before each round, since that is a good way of understanding the champion more, and it will help with making sure you learn what are the best situations to use which Battlerites and so on. But in case you want to just quickly take a loadout and jump straight into a game, here are some loadouts that I use. To start off, here's the standard build I take most of the time. I've explained why I like Headlong Rush and Aerial Strike, and so these are pretty much in all of my Raigon builds, whereas the other three Battlerites are a bit more flexible. Once you're more comfortable with hitting your spacebars and positioning yourself so that you can almost always find value out of your R ability, then taking Royal Descent and Dragon Mastery would mean that you have lots of damage output. So that's kind of what I'm going for here in my standard build. Because of the recent changes to Raigon's healing, I find that I need at least one Battlite that improves his healing just so that he can survive easier. Duelist is my top choice for the reasons I mentioned earlier, and so that's why I pick it in my standard build. If you feel like you easily overcommit and might need more healing, then perhaps exchanging Royal Descent or Dragon Mastery for Invigorate could be pretty helpful. That of course depends on whether you are better at using your spacebar or your R ability. If you're not too keen about Dragon Mastery, or perhaps when you're trying to play a slightly less aggressive role, then taking Riposte instead might be quite okay too, and here's what the build might look like. The only thing about this build is that you can't replace a Battlite for Invigorate since you already have two Battlerites that improve your Q, so you might have to be careful a bit to make sure you stay alive. So yeah, these are the builds I typically use as Raigon because I prefer a more aggressive playstyle when I play with him. I reckon a lot of his Battlerites alter his playstyle in a rather significant way, so definitely try to think up your own build and style when you do decide to play more Raigon. And so yeah, that's about it on Raigon's Battlerites and Loadouts. That was a fairly lengthy part, but we'll now move on to champions that synergize with Raigon before we finish the guide with some final notes on Raigon. On team compositions, I find that Raigon can synergize with most champions quite well. Support teammates can keep the already very survivable Raigon even more tanky with the heals and support, and so they make superb teammates for Raigon. Melee champions like Raigon typically take a lot of damage when they jump in to deal damage, and so not needing to worry about health as much is a massive plus. Ranged DPS champions can enjoy having a melee teammate like Raigon to draw attention away from them and peel for them so that they can do their job better, and that's why I think Raigon is a good teammate for ranged champions as well. Due to Raigon's ability to disable enemies from afar, melee teammates will like Raigon as a teammate as well because they can easily go in and do damage without having to worry about burning it out just to get close to the enemies to attack them. Having said that though, Raigon does have a bit of issues in terms of space when he has other melee teammates around, since they get in the way of each other when he's trying to chase people down and so on, or use his R ability, and so that might be something to consider. Raigon just needs to adjust his playstyle according to how his teammates tend to play, and he should be good I think. playing a more defensive role or back and forth kind of playstyle will help a lot when you have ranged teammates, and if you're put with melee teammates, then you'll probably want to be playing a bit more aggressively with maybe a bit of a supporting role here and there. So yeah, I would say Raigon is quite a straightforward melee champion to play, and he's a ton of fun once you get used to playing him and doing some nice combos. With some good cooldown management, Raigon can contribute a lot to winning the fight, even if the player himself is inexperienced, and so he's definitely a good champion to pick up if you're new to the game and you like to play melee champions more than ranged champions. As I mentioned earlier, you may find him to be easily read by enemies at higher ranks, and so at that point you'll probably have to learn to be a bit more unpredictable with how you engage, how you escape, how you attack, and so on, so that's something to bear in mind. It's a bit hard to teach all that, and it's probably something that is better gained with practice and experience with Raigon, so just get out there and play more with him. And so yeah, that's about it for my Raigon guide. I hope you guys found it useful. The next Battlerite Champion guide I'll be making would be on Alicia, so you guys can look forward to that. From the votes on my Destiny guide some time ago, Jade was voted to be the next updated guide after Alicia's guide, so you can also expect an updated Jade guide coming soon. And so yeah, that's about it for this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as well. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave any questions or thoughts in the comment section below, share this video with your friends, and you can check out my other videos too if you haven't already. I stream 3 days a week on Twitch nowadays as well, so do check me out at twitch.tv/Chyill as well if you're into watching people play Battlerites live. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, have a great day, keep gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.